Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing some of the mysterious attacks that's been happening on one of Iran's nuclear sites and also security sites in recent weeks as Iran is close to nuclear breakout. Warm welcome to the programme, and I have two very special guests to discuss Iran's nuclear weapons programme and how this has been dented in recent weeks. I'll be joined by Peter Bourne, who is one of the co-founders of South End Friends of Israel, as well as Robin Benson, who's a Christian political commentator. So, gentlemen, welcome to the Middle East Report, and it's great to have studio guests again. Peter, I have to... welcome back to the Middle East Report. Can you share with us what you've been doing for Israel since the COVID-19 lockdown, when everyone's been on Zoom, essentially?
Lovely to be here again, Simon. Naturally, it's been we've been quite limited to what we can achieve because of COVID-19, but we've been having Zoom meetings with the Friends of Israel groups, and we've had in the last couple of weeks, I should say, a real big success story, which I'm sure your viewers would be glad to hear. For the last 2 years, various anti-Israel political parties within the Republic of Ireland had been running a campaign to boycott goods from certain areas of Israel. And we started up a grassroots campaign to challenge that. And in the last couple of weeks, a new Irish government has been formed, and they've dropped the proposed boycott of Israel goods from their manifesto. So that was a real win for us and a real defeat for the BDS movement. And we are following up that campaign with something similar, this time directed of the government of Chile, whose Senate have just passed legislation, hasn't been enacted yet, it's not effective yet, but also with the objective of boycotting goods from Israel. So we're starting up a similar campaign to challenge that.
Fantastic. So going global now, thanks to Zoom, which is good. And Robin, it's great to have you back on the programme. And personally, thank you so much for your excellent contributions during the COVID-19 lockdown. And you've been very dependable and incredibly reliable. And the amount of research that you've done for the programmes as well has been immense. So great, thank you for that. Robin, what do you make of the series of mysterious explosions that have taken place in Iran over recent weeks, including one in Natanz, which is one of the Iranian nuclear sites that actually holds their centrifuges, and also at other key military sites in recent weeks?
It's been an interesting progression of attacks that have started off late June. They're still going on, because I think there was another one yesterday or today.
Indeed, yeah.
So it's still an unfolding story. When you look at the different facilities that have been attacked, some of them you say, OK, we understand why whoever it is behind this has gone for that, because it is either attached, as you said, to Iran's nuclear research and procurement and development, or it's attached in some way to its missile development and procurement and spread to other terrorist groups. But there have been one or two of the facilities you think, OK, well, why was that attacked? And I think, to me, it leads to the conclusion that there's somebody knows what else is going on at these facilities, that the Iranians have been trying to hide. They've hidden it possibly from the International Atomic Energy Agency. They've hidden it from other groups who are trying to discover it. I mean, it leads you to an inevitable conclusion that there are one or two agencies, one in particular, the Mossad, you know, let's name the name, who probably know much more than anybody else in the world what is going on in Iran, what it's up to, what it's been covering up for decades. And I think what has been happening at these facilities is evidence that someone somewhere has taken the decision that a red line has been crossed, and we are going to prevent no matter what the cost, we're going to prevent Iran progressing any further than it already has. And we're seeing evidence of that literally almost on a daily basis.
And Peter, you've been studying and watching Iran, because we've done a number of different programs on it, and you've highlighted some of the devastation that's been caused in Iran over recent years, including mass floodings, bird flu, combined with the economic sanctions. But also Iran's been hit badly by the COVID-19 crisis, together as well as an energy producer, and with the price of oil absolutely plummeting because there is virtually no demand for oil once the whole world is in lockdown. This is having serious repercussions for the Iranian economy. So can you describe the domestic situation facing the Iranian regime and, of course, the Iranian people?
Yeah, of course. So let's bring your viewers back to the beginning of the Trump presidency. Round about that time, coincidentally or not, we'll let the world decide, there were a series of devastating events that hit the country of Iran. The first one was a severe earthquake. Iran has always been subject to minor earthquakes, but this one was quite a severe one. Then in 2018, following through all the way to 2020, there were some devastating floods that absolutely ruined the infrastructure of 26 out of 31 provinces of Iran. Villages swept away, roads and bridges devastated, schools ruined, and hundreds of lives lost. In addition to that, again, your viewers may not be aware, but there was actually the biblical plague of locusts. In January of this year, desert locusts swarmed Iran, and they were unable, not only were they able to produce sufficient food domestically, which they have always been allowed to do, enabled to do, but also any surplus goes for export. They didn't have enough to export and had to, indeed, for the first time ever, import foodstuffs. So through a series of natural disasters, exacerbated by the sanctions of the presidency of Donald Trump, in addition to a devastating outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, has absolutely ruined the Iranian economy. This showed itself with riots earlier this year, and although the mainstream media played some of the riots to the world at large, about 3,000 Iranians were killed in those riots. So by the totalitarian theocracy of the government. So from an economic standpoint, domestically, Iran is on its knees. As you quite rightly said, they have so much oil that they can't export, that the storage facilities are full. There is no point Iran retrieving more oil from the ground because there's nowhere for it to go. The Iranian rial, as we speak today, Simon, is at 275,000 rials to the dollar. The official rate is 42,000, but the balance of payments, GDP rather, I should say, from a surplus of 13% 2 years ago is minus 15% now. So all these things seem to be building up to actually devastate the Iranian economy.
I thank you for informing us. That was very informative. And let's have a look now at this news report that examines some of the mysterious explosions that have taken place in Iran in recent weeks.
With sounds of thunder and lightning, Israel's new Ofek 16, or Horizon 16 reconnaissance satellite, broke into orbit Monday morning at 4 a.m. from the Palmachim airbase. The optoelectronic satellite boasts advanced capabilities and improved precision and follows the Ofek 11, which was launched in 2016. Defense Minister Benny Gantz hailing the launch, calling it a mighty achievement for the defense industries in general and for Israel Aerospace Industries, which partnered in the project in particular. Now, while the launch has been in the works for months, Ofek 16's mission, among other things, has already been directed at keeping tabs on Iran, especially as Iran continues to develop its nuclear and missile capabilities. This new directive also follows several mysterious explosions and cyber attacks targeting Iranian military and research facilities over the past few weeks, including at the Natanz nuclear center, the Kojir missile manufacturing plant, the Zargan power plant, and the Karun petrochemical center. Sources in the Middle East claiming Israel is responsible for these targeted attacks, which Iranian officials now admit caused considerable damages to their sensitive facilities. Israel then also now reportedly preparing for potential Iranian retaliation in the form of cyber attacks, missile attacks from Syria, or some other such assault. Israeli Defense Minister and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz still playing off accusations, though, saying on public radio that everyone can be suspicious of us all the time, but that not every event that happens in Iran is connected to us. That said, he adds that, quote, a nuclear Iran is a threat to the world and the region, as well as a threat to Israel, and we will do everything to prevent that from happening. Iran, for its part, also now increasing its threatening rhetoric. Top commanders within the IRGC's Navy claiming Sunday that Iran has built underground missile cities all across the coasts of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, cities that would, quote, be a nightmare for Iran's enemies.
Thick black smoke rising up to the sky over a sensitive military facility in Iran. This time it is a power plant in the city of Ahvaz in the southwest.
None of the front page of the Tehran press are mentioning it. So this is a security issue. The Iranian press seems to be scared of addressing this issue.
The Iranian media is well aware that this probably is not an isolated case. It began over a week ago with a powerful blast at the Parchin military complex, not far from the capital Tehran. That night, a large fire broke out in a power plant in the city of Shiraz, leaving the city and its more than 1.5 million people in the dark for hours. Last Thursday, another mysterious fire broke out, this time at the uranium enrichment facility in Natanz, and finally, on Saturday, the latest incident in Ahvaz.
So far, the only thing Iran has said is that if it finds out that these explosions are the work of an outside country, then Iran will retaliate.
When it comes to an outside enemy, the first name that comes to mind is that of the usual suspect.
I managed to sit down with the U.S. Special Representative for Iran, Brian Hook. I discussed with him the unceasing Iranian threat, as well as our constant activity against the Iranian threat.
Israel has the interest and the ability to damage Iran's facilities, but it is not the only one. Various Gulf nations are just as worried about Iran's regional and nuclear ambitions, mostly Saudi Arabia, which still feels it has a score to settle following the Iranian attack on its oil fields last year. And it doesn't end there. The internal situation in the Islamic Republic is far from peaceful.
Since March this year, there have been more than 1,000 cases of fires breaking out in Iran. The public, I think, are becoming angrier about the lack of security and the lack of management when it comes to the management of safety in their own country.
Internal unrest, actions by a foreign country, or malfunctions due to poor infrastructure, whatever the cause, it puts Iran in a vulnerable position, and only time will tell how it might react.
And we're not hearing those news reports on our mainstream news. That's why it's so important to watch what's occurring in Iran, particularly over these mysterious explosions. Robin, do you think this is a coincidence? Because I'm just going to read out a quote from this one. Primarily is that last month we saw that the Director General of the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the IAEA, Rafael Mario Grossi, raised serious concerns about the possible clandestine and undeclared nuclear sites in Iran, and this is his quote. He says the agency identified a number of questions related to possible undeclared nuclear material and nuclear-related activities at 3 locations in Iran. The agency, the report clarified, sought access to 2 of the locations. Iran has not provided access to these locations and has not engaged in substantive discussions to clarify the agency's question. Now, this is a clear contrast from the war in Iraq in 2003, in which the United States, Britain and other allied nations went in and removed Saddam Hussein from power. This is actually coming from the United Nations' own nuclear watchdog, saying how the Iranians are not living up to the Iran deal and they're not allowing UN weapons inspectors to inspect their sites. And the fearing is that they could be very, very close to breakout. Is it because the Iranians have announced that they're close to breakout that we're seeing now all these mysterious explosions happening in Iran, and particularly the most important of all, the attack on Iran's nuclear site in Natanz that holds the centrifuges?
I think you're building a good case. I think also that we have to go back to the Israeli Mossad's theft of all of that information from a lock-up garage somewhere in Tehran, was it a year or 2 ago? And that information, they're still sifting through that. And I read recently that the Mossad are still passing on new bits and pieces to their allies, probably to this agency. So you put all of this together, and as I said before, somebody has a much bigger picture as to what Iran is actually doing, at what stage it's at in its development of nuclear missiles, and they've decided somewhere, whether it's in Jerusalem or Washington DC or elsewhere, they've decided this is not going to go any further. But instead of launching an all-out attack, they're doing it piecemeal, bit by bit, taking out different facilities that I would suspect all have some sort of major bearing on the program, on the nuclear program in particular. And it would be very interesting to know if the 3 facilities that are mentioned in that quote actually have appeared in some of the attacks that have happened since the end of June. They don't list who they are, but it will be very interesting to know actually if those 3 have been in amongst the ones that have been attacked in the past couple of weeks.
And Peter, we have to acknowledge the fact that the Iranian regime, ever since the Islamic Revolution came to power, overthrew the Shah of Iran in 1979, has been belligerent towards Israel. Their previous president, Ahmadinejad, over 10 years ago, declared he wanted to see Israel wiped off the face of the earth. He denied the Holocaust. Iran is currently supporting Islamic terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, with the intention of destroying Israel, as well as having something like 50 or 60,000 troops in Syria, only 60 so miles away from Israel's border on the Golan Heights. So we know that the ultimate foreign policy goal of the Iranian regime is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And of course, the Jewish people, having been through the Holocaust, as we approach really the 80th anniversary of the start of the Second World War, it's important to take that perspective, isn't it? That Israel will not allow any nation to threaten them, and there's only one nation on the planet that is actually threatening Israel with annihilation, and that's the Islamic Republic of Iran. Does this make this very, very serious in terms of the thinking behind the Israeli government and its security services?
It does indeed, but there's a couple of things geopolitically that I think we've got to look back on, and it's not as gloomy a picture as one may think. So towards the end of the Obama regime, we saw something that we never thought would happen. A US president literally stab one of his closest allies in the back by cozying up to the Iranian regime and literally pouring billions of dollars back into their coffers, when it was known that Iran not only shout out death to Israel, but also death to America. That, I think, has been unprecedented and unforgivable in US politics. Fortunately, after Obama left office, we had President Donald Trump. As we know, a very strong supporter of the State of Israel. Running parallel with that, we also had the very unheard of dynamic that all of a sudden certain Arab nations, because of their hatred towards Iran, began to develop relationships with Israel because they had a common enemy in Iran. So we've seen the Gulf states especially build up relationships with Israel in the hope of creating an axis against the Iranian regime. And something else is very interesting to me in these Middle Eastern politics, and this is as follows. We know that there is an axis of Russia and Iran backing the Syrian regime of President Assad. But what is quite unusual is that during the last 3 years, we have seen no end of Israeli attacks on Iranian targets within Syria. And all this is with a wink and a nod to President Putin of Russia. If he didn't want Israel to do that, Israel would not be doing it. But he's allowing his so-called ally, I think the Iranians are useful idiots to the Russians, and he's allowing Israel time after time to bomb Iranian targets within Syria. So that's a very interesting dynamic in all this. Going back to what we were talking about the Iranian economy, one thing we didn't mention, of course, was the cost to Iran of funding all these groups, these anti-Israel groups, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon. And we've seen in Lebanon, with Hezbollah, how the Lebanese people are beginning to react against the Hezbollah factions. So all these things put together with Israel's determination not to allow Iran any flexibility in going further with their nuclear ambitions, seems to me that there's an axis building up. Not only, Israel is not on its own, she has other players in the region who are as determined as she is to see Iran's, to weaken Iran militarily.
Absolutely.
And just one other thing, I read an interesting article in the last couple of days that pointed out that one of the other major concerns that Israel has at the moment is the Iranian move to equip Hezbollah, Syria, some of the other terrorist groups with precision-guided missiles, not necessarily shipping actual missiles to these groups, but shipping the components that allow them to take old missile technology and transform it and make it into precision-guided. And the thought is that quite a number of these attacks that Israel has been carrying out in Syria on depots has been to take out this equipment, to stop it getting into the hands of those like Hezbollah who would use it against Israel. So that's another dynamic, a further dynamic on top of the nuclear one that seems actually to be more pressing at the moment. Absolutely. As far as Israel's security system is concerned.
That's essentially a game changer. It means that
yes.
civilian Israeli targets would come into the paradigm of Hezbollah attacks on Israel and make the situation far more
Hamas
dangerous.
In the Gaza Strip, or Islamic, Palestinian Islamic Jihad as well in the Gaza Strip, they think are being equipped by Iran, circumventing certain restrictions, getting this stuff to them as well.
So let's have a look now at 4 violations that the Iranian regime has broken in terms of its absolute pursuit for nuclear weapons.
But Iran's detention of this inspector was without question an outrageous and unwarranted act of intimidation.
And while the world is concentrating on tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, condemning Israel for building homes or wanting to extend Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, and dealing with Brexit, this is the biggest foreign policy challenge our generation faces, a nuclear Iran, which would be a total game changer in the Middle East and also threaten European security and British security. Robin, we know that the Iranian regime is the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism. They are abuser of human rights. They persecute Christians. They have a global international terror network where they support terror organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other terrorist groups around the world. But why is this, and particularly these mysterious attacks, the fact is that the Iranian regime is in breach of the United Nations' own nuclear atomic energy agency's guidelines on nuclear weapons, and virtually no media coverage, no political interest on this subject, which is so critical for not only the security and peace of the Middle East, but for the free world.
I think you've got a combination of factors. I mean, I'm certain, I mean, Peter may disagree, but I'm certain that the COVID-19 thing has become an obsession with our media to the point where, I don't know about you, I hardly watch the news anymore because I'm fed up being reminded of the number of infections and the number of deaths. Not that, you know, death is a lightweight thing, but it has become a daily routine. But the media is fixated with it, and now they're projecting a second wave in the winter. And, you know, we've had all sorts of prognostications about how bad that's going to be. So in other words, they're already building up a case for more COVID-19, and it hasn't even happened yet. And Brexit has crept back into the UK news cycle, and you've got Keir Starmer and some of the things that he has or hasn't done, and it's almost as if we've become obsessed with ourselves. And pardon the expression, the rest of the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and nobody really cares. No one cares about this serious issue that we know is serious, but it's like the rest seem to have got their head buried in the sand and just are going to hope that it goes away. But I think another factor is that the European Union and the UK government, I think, to a certain extent, but certainly the EU, has taken the hump as far as President Trump is concerned. And he's seen to be the one that's created all of this problem by pulling the US out of the agreement and then reimposing tight sanctions, which absolutely has played havoc with all the money grabbers in the European Union who saw the dollars and the pound signs and the euro signs flicking round as they thought of all the contracts that they were going to match up with their Iranian counterparts and the money they were going to get out of it. And they're angry that this source of funding has actually been cut off by what the Americans have done. So you've got a combination of factors that just means we don't want to go there. Yeah, and we're not going to go there until maybe President Trump is gone and Biden is in, and then we'll look at the whole thing again and we'll all be happy once more. And they don't realize that when the Iranians say what they say, they mean it. They think it's just rhetoric. They don't realize that when the Iranians say they want to wipe Israel off the map, they want to wipe Israel off the map. And that's the reality of it. And the thing is, the politicians, the diplomats, don't believe it. They think it's just posturing. They think it's a way of getting something more out of the West. Iran's leadership, not the people, but the democracy, that's their goal, to do that, because they think in their overall scheme of their theology that by creating chaos in the world, particularly in the Middle East, they're going to bring back their Messiah, the Mahdi, the hidden Imam. And it's all part of their theology. And of course, when you bring God into the equation, the European politicians just run off in a corner into a dark room and don't want to know about it. So you've got a whole multitude of factors that are feeding into this blindness, this unwillingness to see the danger that's there confronting the Western world.
Peter, Robin makes a very valid point that as a Western nation, we've become so self-obsessed that we're not actually looking out and actually looking at the big threats further afield, and particularly the response of the European Union, who are very unhappy with the fact that President Trump got elected in 2016, be even more upset if he gets re-elected in November 2020. But they're cozying up to the Iranian regime and not really understanding the danger that it poses to the Middle East and also that of Europe with their intercontinental ballistic missiles. And particularly if they have nuclear breakout, they were able to put those nuclear warheads onto their missiles and actually target Europe. This is so serious, and it poses an existential threat to the European Union. Why are they so inward-looking when it comes to dealing with the Iranian regime and not seeing the true face of this regime and the oppression it's bringing upon the people of Iran?
An interesting question. I don't know the answers to it. My intuitive feel is, if we look at the United Nations as it is at the moment, I think one American commentator, one diplomat, called it the theatre of the absurd, and it truly is. And if we look at the Security Council, made up of Russia, China, Great Britain, France, etc., isn't this a paradox? We have an Islamic totalitarian theocracy that's now got into bed with the Chinese government because they need funding, actually. Apparently, talk of a $25 billion bailout, but the Chinese aren't stupid. They know that just pouring money into Iran is going to go the same way as they did when they poured money into Venezuela in the hope of getting a foothold in there, and that came to nothing. But the paradox is that we have an Islamic republic that is now beholden and friendly with China, that has put 2 million Muslims into concentration camps. This is the height of hypocrisy. But we don't see any protests on the streets from our Muslim brothers in the West about this. Uyghurs in concentration camps, and China and Iran seem to be okay with that. Then we have the part that Russia's playing. And let's look at what Russia and Syria and Iran are doing in Syria, where Russia and China, two members of the Security Council, have just vetoed corridors to allow humanitarian aid into Syria. It's an absolute absurdity. And the European Union, I think, Simon, have been, their inertia is staggering, but I think what they're waiting for, frankly, is the outcome of the next presidential election in the United States. If President Trump gets in again, I think they're going to have a total rethink. If, as they hope, Joe Biden gets in, I think we're almost back to the appeasement phase with Iran. But I think the reason we're seeing so much inactivity from the European Union is simply because they're waiting the outcome of the US election, which is just, as we speak, 4 months away.
Absolutely. And Robin, when we talk about this explosion that's occurred at the Natanz nuclear site that occurred, I think it was on the 2nd of July, has actually damaged so many of the centrifuges, and it's called significant structural damage to the building and destroyed the auxiliary diesel generators used to back up their power in which they need the centrifuges in order to enrich uranium to actually create the nuclear weapon. There must be incredible fear in the heart of the Iranian regime, because there must be someone or people who are actually leaking classified intelligence regarding their nuclear program and seeing that their plans to develop a nuclear bomb have now just gone up in flames. And according to one Israeli intelligence analyst, this has put their nuclear program back by 2 years. So it shows that something's not right in the heart of the regime, surely.
Yes, it does, you're right. And I wonder if that's why the Iranians have been so coy so far about attributing blame and threatening revenge, is because they're just so sideswiped by this succession of attacks on different facilities across the Iranian nation. It's almost on a daily basis now something is happening, and it must be really rattling them to think that the possibility, there's several possibilities here, that there are, and we're just speculating, okay, I'm speculating, but they're speculating that there's a possibility that there are American CIA or Israeli Mossad or both agents in Iran, that the possibility that one of those facilities was bombed from a stealth aircraft, because that's what the satellite footage shows. But there's a fourth possibility that some of the reports have highlighted, that some of this is actually being done by fifth columnists, Iranians, within the nation.
Absolutely.
Whether they're whether they're pro-Israel or pro-American is question mark, but they're certainly anti-regime, and that they're the ones that are actually behind some of the attacks where it's clear it's not a computer virus and it's not a bomb in the sense of something dropping out of the sky. So it's something that's happened from within the country. So that in itself, along with one of the footages that you showed talked about 1,000 fires in the last year or so. This is Iranians doing this to their own, their own setup. So it must be really rattling this regime, and they're going to wonder, where's the next one coming from? And I think there's an inherent danger in this, because it may get to the point where they just lash out. And I don't want to be apocalyptic, I'm just pointing it out. You put an animal into a corner, and you really corner it, and it will get to the point where it just cannot do anything else but attack. And I think I hope those that are perpetrating this realize, don't push the Iranians too far. Let them know that you know what they're up to, and that they're capable of taking it away from them at a moment's notice, but don't push them so far into the corner that they just lash out in order to deflect attention away from themselves and their failure to keep the nation secure.
But their military capabilities are very weak, particularly with the assassination of their general Soleimani. Their capabilities to actually strike back now are very limited. If they then invest in warfare against Israel from Syria or other places, they're soon going to run out of money, and Israel will strike them. So I don't think the Iranian regime has many options left in terms of actually striking out at the West and what have you. They don't have the terror capabilities they had over a decade or so ago that they once had.
Yeah, but there's also the fact that we know that they have sleepers all over the world, so the attack doesn't necessarily have to come literally over the border. It could be against American, it could be against Israeli, it could be against other Western nations' interests in foreign countries. So, I mean, there's lots at play here.
Absolutely, and this is why it's so important we're discussing this for Israel's security and also Western security. Let's have a look now at the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a press conference with America's top Iranian guy discussing Iran's nuclear weapons program.
Good morning to all of you. Welcome to Jerusalem again, Brian. We have serious issues to discuss. They're so serious that they cannot even wait for COVID-19. And I appreciate your making the visit to Israel today. You've been the point man for President Trump's campaign of maximum pressure on Iran. This campaign is based on one simple principle. If Iran wants to be treated like a normal country, it should behave like a normal country. But it doesn't. It deliberately deceives the international community. It lies all the time. It lies on solemn pledges and commitments that it took before the international community. It continues its secret program to develop nuclear weapons. It continues its secret program to develop the means to deliver nuclear weapons. Iran denies access to the IAEA inspectors to important sites, some of which we have uncovered through our own activity. It continues its rampant aggression across the Middle East and beyond. It arms, trains, finances, and dispatches terrorists. Iran is doing all that, and most of the international community is doing nothing in the face of it. And worse than nothing, many countries collude in this aggression. So I want to thank President Trump and express our appreciation to what he and your administration is doing. Iran tried to intimidate the United States from taking action against Iranian aggression. It wanted to apply sufficient pressures so that the United States would back off from this campaign of maximum pressure. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards, led by the arch-terrorist Qasem Soleimani, launched a proxy war against the United States forces and allies in the region, and I can say the plan failed. It failed because the United States refused to be intimidated, and in fact, you took important and courageous decisions to take out Soleimani. And by removing that arch-terrorist, you drew a clear line in the sand, a line that was etched in deeds, not in words only. And I think those deeds speak loudly all the time and to everyone in this region. Now, without the determination to use military force against those who plan to attack you, the danger simply grows greater and greater. This is a policy, Brian, that we have adopted as well. We are absolutely resolved to prevent Iran from entrenching itself militarily in our immediate vicinity. We take repeated and forceful military action against Iran and its proxies in Syria and elsewhere as necessary. And I say to the Ayatollahs in Tehran, Israel will continue to take these actions necessary to prevent you from creating another terror and military front against Israel in Syria. And I say to Bashar al-Assad, you are risking the future of your country and your regime. Israel will not allow Iran to establish a military presence in Syria. Brian, in response to the repeated Iranian provocations and violations, you have taken important actions, and I believe it is time to implement now snapback sanctions. I don't think we can afford to wait. We should not wait for Iran to start its breakout to a nuclear weapon, because when that happens, it will be too late for sanctions. So my position remains clear. We will do whatever is necessary to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. I know that's your position as well. This is part of the great partnership and alliance between both our countries. And again, I want to thank you for your friendship, for your resistance to aggression, and for your sponsorship of our alliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Netanyahu. We see eye to eye on the dangers of letting the arms embargo expire on Iran.
And great to see that the Israeli Prime Minister there, Benjamin Netanyahu, talking with moral clarity regarding the nuclear threat posed to Israel from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Peter, I have to discuss what happened 10 years ago, because it's believed that the Israeli security forces, as well as American security forces, came up with what's known as the Sinex virus, which was a cyber attack on Iran's nuclear facilities in Natanz. It destroyed 1,000 centrifuges out of 5,000 that actually delayed Iran's ability to have nuclear weapons. Are we seeing, with these mysterious attacks in Iran, the collaboration again of the United States and Israel doing everything they can together, even with resistance groups within the Iranian regime, to actually prevent them from getting to that position where they have a nuclear breakout?
Yeah, we probably are. And it's apart from the US and Israel, it's probably the Gulf states as well collaborating all together. And let's just recap. We've had the natural disasters that have befallen Iran. We've had external military pressure on Iran. We've had domestic riots within Iran. And now we've got a fourth issue, cyber attacks. And who would have thought that we'd be talking about such a thing, let's say 12, 15 years ago? One thing we do know, Simon, is that Israel is a centre of excellence when it comes to all things to do with security issues regarding technology. So I'm pretty certain, I mean, it goes without saying, that there are various departments within the Israeli military government that are working towards damaging Iranian infrastructure, whether that's nuclear facilities or just regular or water supplies or just regular home electrical supplies, etc., to do that. And you can be certain that Iran, which also has an intellectual population, young intellectual population, is working towards the same objective. It is to be hoped that Israel and her allies will win that particular battle, and it seems to date that they've certainly been exceptionally successful.
And Robin, it's according to the Times of Israel, there was an article saying how the Iranians tried to carry out an attempted cyber attack on Israel's water infrastructure, and the Israeli leaders saw this as a red line, because this is a civilian infrastructure and would affect so many Israeli civilians had that cyber attack worked. Do you think that is what it was, that here the Iranians are deliberately targeting Israel's water infrastructure, which is so critical in Israel because of the shortage of rain? The water is such a precious resource that this meant that this was a red line for Israel, and therefore Israel has responded in kind to do everything they can at this moment in time, knowing that window of opportunity to confront the Iranian regime could only be there as far as January of 2021 if President Trump is not re-elected in November.
Yeah, and I think, again, you've got a variety of factors there. I mean, the Israeli government made it clear at the time that they believed the Iranians had stepped right over the red line when they attacked the water infrastructure. I mean, they were trying to mess around with the purity of the water and inject extra levels of some sort of salt into the water, which would have poisoned thousands of Israeli people. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It was caught. But Israel said, you know, this is a red line, you've walked over it, and there will be repercussions. And I think we, as the world, sort of sat back and waited to see, and there was the attack on the infrastructure of one of Iran's major ports, you know, not long afterwards, and then things went quiet. But as you say, we also, and as Peter has mentioned, we've got a US general election coming up. That plus the information that's obviously coming out on what Iran is doing behind the scenes, I think has all come together. So an accumulation of situations, and Israel, let's say Israel and or the US have decided to act together and do the things that we've been seeing happening over the last couple of weeks.
And let's go to this video. If you are not convinced by the Iranian threat to Israel, then you will be after this video, which is entitled Iran Leader Urges Final Solution, and where we heard final solution from before, the Nazis.
Israel, the United States, and Iran are at it again in a war of words over a controversial graphic posted on Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's website, showing people celebrating at the Temple Mount compound in Jerusalem after apparently capturing it from Israel. You can see the Palestinian flag there raised over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The graphic reads, "The final solution, resistance until freedom." The post sparking outrage, America's top diplomat, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, hitting back, calling the Supreme Leader's comments disgusting, hateful, and not representative of the Iranian people. Pompeo pointing out two earlier tweets by the Iranian Supreme Leader calling Israel a cancerous tumor and calling for arming the Palestinians in the West Bank. But he didn't stop there, Pompeo slamming Khamenei for using the Nazi call for the final solution, and seemingly referring to the UN arms embargo on Iran, which is set to expire in October, Pompeo adding, "Is this someone who can be trusted with deadly weapons?" The Israeli Prime Minister's office also swift to reply, pointing out the words "the final solution," saying it brings to mind the Nazis' plan to annihilate the Jewish people, warning Iran that its threats to destroy Israel would put it in similar danger. The poster on Khamenei's website appears to have since been deleted.
And all of you should know from this program that Israel is not an ordinary nation, that Israel has God's hand of blessing upon it, and those who bless Israel shall be blessed, and those who curse Israel shall be cursed, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And that's what I want to bring you on, Peter, in the final closing minutes of the program. Are we seeing the hand of God acting against the Iranian regime? Because the Iranian regime constantly targets Israel with the threat of terrorism, with rhetoric of annihilation and genocide, and the world's most dangerous regime is wanting to build the world's most dangerous weapon.
Simon, we're all religious people on this programme, and I'm sure the vast majority of your viewers are. Surely it's no coincidence that in the last few years we've seen a plague of locusts and floods in the country of Iran. I need elaborate no further.
And finally, in closing, Robin, we are again seeing in history, aren't we, the fulfilment of Genesis 12, 1 to 3, being fulfilled with our own eyes as we see that Iran is on the verge of economic and total collapse, despite the fact it's wanting to pursue its nuclear ambitions.
Yes, I mean, Peter said it well. God is on the move. He will not be mocked. And I'm sure the viewers know the quote that you've used from Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3 in particular. And I think we are seeing that playing out literally, that God has decided. And he uses natural things and he uses human beings to fulfill his purposes. And I would totally agree with both of you that God is on the move and he's using these things to get the attention, particularly of the Iranian people, because they're the ones that are going to suffer the most under this. So we need to be praying for them. Absolutely. We need to be praying for our brothers and sisters in the Iranian church, that they'll stand fast in the midst of the persecution that's been unleashed on them in recent days.
Robin and Peter, thank you so much for being my guests on the Middle East Report. We had a very informative and interesting discussion, so thank you so much. And I just want to thank you for watching this programme today. We've seen that Iran is very close to a nuclear breakout, but we've also seen these very mysterious explosions happen right across the regime, and particularly at their nuclear site in Natanz, which has most probably set back their nuclear ambitions by 2 years. And this is despite all the economic and social turmoil that the Iranian regime is going through. But it also shows that the God of Israel will defend Israel and will defend the Jewish people, because if you curse the nation of Israel, you will be cursed. So it gives us a choice as Christians. What should we do? Bless or curse Israel? For me, I want to bless Israel and the Jewish people, and we can do that by sharing the truth about Israel and praying for Israel. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
כנפי הכסף רכובים, אבירי הרוח בערים, העזים והטובים כבני רשת ירביעו, לתוך שמיים נקיים, זוהרים שבעה הרקיעים, ואנחנו ממריאים מגולן ועד ים סוף. הים ויסוב החור, והנהר החורבה, טס אחי ופניו לאור, ודגלו עלי אהבה. הסולם רגליו באדמה, על ראשו משמי המלחמה, טס אחי אל מלחמה, כבני רשף יגביהו, כלח חרמש, הוא כחץ שלוח ולוחש, הוא כותב מכתב של אש מגולן ועד ים סוף. נס הים סוף החור, והנהר חרבה. טס אחי ופניו לאור, ודגלו עלי אהבה. על כנפי הכסף רקובים, אבירי הרוח באוויר, העזים והטובים כבני רשת יגביר.